You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra. It's getting really warm these days.
It is. Summertime.
Gotta love it. As you say, in Wyoming, there's only 9 months of winter, so we only get 3 months of summer.
Exactly, and not even that.
Yeah, well, yeah. Anyhow. So today's topic is toxic mold and HVAC units. How often do you hear me talk about HVAC units and mold?
Quite a bit, because they're intricately connected.
Yeah. We live in a world where most people have forced air systems, central air, or if it's just heat, it's a forced air furnace. Well, one problem in one area of the house or in the system itself would expose everybody or every room in the house. Does that make sense?
It does, but I think it's important to really help people understand what an HVAC system, first of all, what HVAC stands for and what it is, because like our grandparents and great-grandparents were used to opening up windows. Yeah. They were used to using fans. The big square box fans. That was their HVAC system. And I think anybody who was born after a certain year, they're like, what do you mean we've never not always had this?
Yeah. So HVAC stands for heating, ventilation, air conditioning. So most people refer to it as central air, meaning it has heat and it has AC. Mm-hmm. But as we very well know, there's all sorts of different types of heating systems. Going back to our grandparents and great-grandparents, they used for heat fireplaces, electric baseboard heat. These are things people still use today. I want to be clear about that. Hydronic baseboard heat, which means it's just, some are just hot water. Some have a solution in them that's got, glycol and a bunch of stuff. Hydronic in the floor. Mm-hmm. So more or less, it's hooked to a boiler, or it's similar to the baseboard. And it just heats down in the floor, I think. And then we already mentioned forced air, but that's what that is for heat.
And I think it's important to mention that, if you go to the East Coast and some of the homes that were built in the 1700s, 1800s, lots of them were stone. Mm-hmm. And that kept, heat in the house because it's built of stone. Lots of the foundations were like rock or other things.
Right.
And that newer homes aren't built that way anymore. And so HVAC and central air play a different role because newer homes are built of lots of materials that should never get wet.
Yep.
But the central air locks in the indoor air quality.
Yeah. So like you said, back in the day, we would just open well, I wouldn't say we, I'm not that old, but they just open windows and get a breeze moving through. And, then like you said, they would get those box fans and put them in the window, but turn them the other way at night. Like there's all sorts of tricks.
They would get air in and out, so they were always getting fresh air in. But if you think about the way we live today, if we're cooking bacon and burning it, we use that ventilating thing, hood fan, right?
Yeah, on the
but
microwave.
Like the air is still in the home. It's still
Exactly.
the same air. So just imagine if you've got mycotoxins and you're not opening windows, you're not opening doors.
Yeah, and you think about, a typical home's probably 1,800 square feet. I think they're getting much bigger. But think about it. Like if you have a basement, a main level, a second level, depending on the setup, you would have one or two systems. There could be a mold problem in the mechanical room in the basement. And if it's close to the return air duct, it's pumping those mycotoxins up to the second level.
Absolutely. And, even for our international listeners, I think as Americans, we're really spoiled with the amount of space we have in a home. We have massive homes. We have massive amounts of land, typically. And if you look at European countries or other countries, South America, like a lot of it's apartments, a lot of it is stacked up on each other.
Yeah.
A lot of it are tiny apartments. And so we're talking about HVAC, but I guess my question for you is if somebody lives in a condo, a complex, they live in South America or France or England, and they live in like these flats with other people, are they all sharing the same HVAC air? Like, is all of that, like, how does that work?
Most of the time, so obviously not knowing the exact circumstances, but most of them have what we call a split system like you see in a hotel.
Okay.
So, like, I have a client that's in New York, and their air quality issues, it might not be from their apartment.
Mm.
And, that's the tough thing about multifamily dwellings is you're going to have to deal with what's going on with your neighbor. But to answer your question, for the most part, they have their own systems. And most of America, now in other countries, I don't know, it's code where you have to have separate systems.
Okay, so they have separate systems, but the smaller your area of living, if there is mold somewhere in the HVAC system, does that mean you get a more concentrated exposure to them? Like if you live in an 800 square foot, one bedroom apartment versus a 3,000 square foot house.
Yeah, as far as airspace, it doesn't, you're talking, a third of the square footage. So I guess what you're asking is does a small space increase the risk of exposure or the amount?
Yes.
And I would say yes.
Wow.
But on the other hand, I guess the point I'm trying to make is if you're in a multifamily building, your neighbor next to you or above you or below you, it doesn't really matter, anyone adjacent to you, you could, even if you have your own systems, you could be pulling in contaminated air from their units.
Wow.
Now, there would have to be lots of factors that would dictate that. But my point is multifamily, you cannot really control the air quality.
That's
You can only do it in your unit.
So how does somebody, whether they live in a multifamily or in a single family home, how do they know if there's mold in their HVAC system?
You can do, obviously, an IEP or a mold specialist. For our listeners that don't know, IEP is Indoor Environmental Professional. It's an umbrella term. I've started to use it a lot more because we have mold mitigators. We have industrial hygienists. I saw something the other day and I can't even remember what it said, but like a home, I can't remember, but everybody uses a different term and a lot of it's for SEO, but you can have them come in. But the best way to address it is there's an association that's called NADCA, which is National Air Duct Cleaners Association.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a certification, I guess, and a group that regulates their members and says, okay, you have to do things to these standards. More or less what they can do is they can come in, do an inspection of the unit itself. I don't know what their standards are, but I know I have a bore scope, We can put bore scopes down in the system. There's air testing we can do. There's surface sampling you can do. There's a bunch. To answer your question, get somebody in there that's NADCA certified and have your ducts cleaned and have your components inspected.
And how often should someone be doing that kind of cleaning, duct cleaning and inspection?
Probably every 2 years.
Okay.
Maybe 3 years.
Okay.
It just depends. Like if you live next to a ranch or a field and your air filters are dirty all the time, which brings up another point, you should change your air filters every 3 months. But if you live, by a rock quarry or whatever, you would probably have to do it more often. But I'll bet most of our listeners, for the most part, don't routinely clean their air ducts.
And so I guess what's interesting to me is, let's say somebody suspects that they have mold issues in their home, and what they don't know is it's in their HVAC system. Is somebody who's going to come and do the mold inspection, are they going to know that they have to test both the home and the HVAC system? I mean, how does that work from an expert's perspective?
Obviously, I can only speak to my expertise, but they should know that.
Okay.
Because it's very common, like you said, you have to figure out, is the defect that's causing the mold associated with the HVAC system?
Okay.
Or is the defect a poor grading and drainage, next to the foundation, and the air handler, the return air grill is close to that area, so meaning there's mold due to that defect, then it's pumping it throughout the home. To answer your question, I don't know what other experts do, but for our listeners, you should make sure you address that with your IEP.
Okay.
And say, hey, what about my air ducts, or my HVAC components? What do you suggest? And if they don't have suggestions, you probably need a better IEP.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
That does make sense. So when people are thinking about, okay, I've never had my ducts cleaned, or I haven't had them cleaned in 5 years, and I think I have a mold problem, do I start with the house testing that, or do I start with the HVAC system? What would you say to that?
It just depends on where the defect is. But
okay.
to kind of dive a little deeper into that, for our listeners, if you know you have a mold problem in the home, but you're not sure where it's at, don't just go have your ducts cleaned.
Okay.
We want, and our listeners hear me say this all the time, we want to stop the bleeding, which is the mold colony itself. Well, in order to do that, we have to discover what defect led to it. If it's in the HVAC system, it's likely like a condensate line that's plugged. It could be a defective whatever on the system, but don't just get your ducts cleaned and expect that the air quality is going to improve.
That makes sense.
Because the duct cleaning is something we do at the SPC stage of everything.
Okay.
Meaning at the end.
At the end. Okay. So if there is a mold infestation, getting to the root cause of how that came about in the first place and dealing with that, and then also dealing with the mold infestation comes before getting into a regular maintenance schedule of duct cleaning.
Yeah, the remediation, the SPC has to happen, especially the remediation, before you have your ducts clean. Because otherwise you go get your ducts clean, and what if it's a mold issue in an exterior wall? Then I'm going to recommend, after the remediation, to do it again.
Yeah.
And I'm sure a lot of our listeners are like, well, how much does it cost? It brings up a good point. There are so many scammers on Facebook for duct cleaning, and they're kind of easy to spot.
Yeah.
But for our listeners, go to the NADCA site, and there's a drop down, or whatever you call them, a link to find someone local to you.
Okay.
Stanley Steamer, who's a big franchise, they usually do it. But my point is, make sure you get a legitimate company. And the cost, depending on what they do, shouldn't be more than $600-700.
Okay.
It's not cheap, but
it's not thousands.
Yeah, and it needs to be done to the NADCA standards, which means that they do it under a vacuum system or negative air.
Okay.
You can't just go willy-nilly blow the stuff out of your ducts.
No.
Because you'll blow it throughout your entire home.
So what's your call to action for people?
Have your systems inspected.
Okay.
I know, in the middle of the summer, it might not make sense, or almost summer, but this fall, before you turn your heat on, make sure you have it inspected.
Okay.
Clear as mud?
Clear as mud.
All right. We have a bunch of courses we've been talking about. We haven't talked about my books in a while. We'll put a link. We have an author link, right?
Yes.
I'll put an author link in the podcast description, but I have 5 books. They're all available on Amazon.
Audible.
And
in paperback, and I think paperback, ebook, and Audible, and ebook and paperback are on Amazon.
Perfect. All right. We appreciate all of our listeners. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also on cnccontractorservices.com find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.